Hi, and welcome to Module 4, Gender, Leadership, and Intersectionality. With this module, we're now more than halfway done the course already and only have one module left after this one. So this course has really sped along, and here we are almost done. I can't believe it. I've chosen this picture because it represents so much of what we'll be discussing in this module. Several years ago, Rebecca Coulter and I, and here's Rebecca right here, she did her PhD at the University of Alberta, so she has the University of Alberta regalia on. She was at the University of Western Ontario, as was I, or Western as it's now called, and we were invited by the Education Board at Walpole Island, an Indigenous community near Sarnia, Ontario, and literally across a short bridge from the small town of Wallaceburg, Ontario, to do a study and provide them with a report on their school, how to improve its practices and its results. Rebecca and I spent some time each week for, I don't know, probably at least a couple of months, maybe even longer, talking to school staff, the principal, community members, and the high school admin at the high school that the young people from Walpole Island attended. We provided an extensive report, and about 5 years later, another team came in to do a report and found ours sitting on a shelf. They read it, asked if anything had been implemented, and recommended, after being told that not too much of it had been actually, because there have been administrative changes, and you know what happens to these reports sometimes, but they recommended that the recommendations be revisited. Among those recommendations was a suggestion to develop leadership from within the community to support the Board of Education and school leadership. Shortly after that, Rebecca was approached about setting up a master's cohort-based program that would take place in the community at the university and online. It's not unlike the MES program, really. However, the emphasis in this case would be on Indigenous educational leadership. I was actually teaching at the University of Alberta at the time, and when Rebecca approached me about coming to Walpole Island to teach that summer, I had to think about it about 1 nanosecond before I said a resounding yes, if I could get permission. And I did. And off I went to London, Ontario, first of all, en route to Walpole Island. And I had never actually been there, but I found this beautiful island. We were put up in a lovely home on the reserve, and we were able to go to the school each day and teach the course. So it really situated us in the context within which these teachers and administrators were working. They were a very enthusiastic group, very hardworking, and although I didn't have an opportunity to teach again in the program, I was thrilled to be a part of it in a small way at least, particularly because one of my friends, Joanne Henry, who was the secretary of the school actually when I first started teaching at Chippewas of the Thames, and I talk about a little bit about that in my introduction to the course video, but Joanne was the secretary of the school at the time, and she was so helpful and helped me so much. And so I took a turn helping her when she decided to become a teacher, and went up north of Toronto to a university up there to do her coursework, and then she would do her practicum right in the school itself. And I worked with her as her mentor teacher, and at that time I was the principal of the school, and so it was just a wonderful experience to be there to help her through that experience, and then go on, as it turned out, to really wonderful things working at the provincial level with Indigenous education initiatives and all kinds of interesting stuff. But anyway, this group worked very, very hard. Some actually became administrators within the school, and they were supported well by the community itself, and all graduated, and in fact produced a book out of the research projects that they did at the end of their course. So it was a wonderful experience. But to me, this group, this very special group to me, because of the relationship that I have with them, that you see graduating here, demonstrates in so many important ways the notion of intersectionality. That is, the compounding of vulnerabilities around race, class, language, and gender, and the strength of those people who, in fact, have those kinds of experiences. The 4 papers in this module consider layered forms of these kinds of discrimination that's premised on gender, race, citizenship status, religion, and so on, and the ways in which they intersect in school practices to compound multiple forms of oppression. I'm not going to, in this video, talk about each of the readings individually. I'm just going to give a quick précis when we look at the authors here, and then I'm going to take one of the themes and develop it further. So let's look first of all at Tanya Fitzgerald. She's at La Trobe University in Melbourne, Australia. She's an Irish woman, actually. She's from Australia, or from Ireland. She lives in Australia, and I'm guessing in working with a group of Indigenous women leaders in courses or in research she was doing or whatever. Anyway, in that relationship, they came to her to ask if she would work with them to research Indigenous women and school leadership. And they did that very strategically because they recognized that unfortunately, in many ways, she had a far larger voice than they did, and they wanted to magnify their voices. So they were quite strategic about this. And she was quite willing to be strategic with them. She talks in this paper about her awareness of her position of privilege in relation to these women, but they negotiated together and found a way to ensure that from their perspective, what was important was that their voices, the voices of Indigenous women leaders in education from Australia, New Zealand, and eventually this research project included Canada as well, were primary in the research and what you learn from the research. Sharon Curtis is nursery manager at Ellesmere Children's Centre in Sheffield, UK, and she's committed to working as a social justice advocate on behalf of marginalized children, their families, and their community that are served by the Children's Centre that she provides really stellar leadership for. Her paper explores the experience of Black women in school leadership, and you can probably guess why that was the subject that she chose for her doctoral work. And her findings point to not only the challenges that these women experienced, but also the strength that comes out of those challenges. That strength meant that rather than viewing their circumstances through a deficit lens, they developed their cultural literacy and used it as a vehicle for social justice for themselves and the students and communities that they served. Sadly, however, she also describes the way in which their colleagues were often reluctant to deal with issues of race and proved not to be their allies quite often. I've already introduced Chris Bruner, and you see her picture again here, and I introduced her in Module 2, where she was a co-author with another writer. But in this case, she's working with Mary J. DeLone, who actually is the primary author of this paper. You'll notice that her name is listed first. DeLeon and Bruner write a fulsome and fascinating, I found it quite fascinating, account of the experience of gay and lesbian educational leaders. This is a subject area that has had minimal attention actually in the literature, so there isn't a lot of literature, although that's growing. In fact, Ed Policy Studies had Catherine Lugg come and work in our department for a while, and her work is primarily around this very same subject, just as an aside. But nevertheless, they wrote this paper, which, as it turns out, is a very long paper. But several pages up front talk about the complex and very careful approach they needed to engage in order to work ethically with gay and lesbian leaders who in the U.S. who were and still are highly vulnerable in school systems and communities, particularly because they're in the U.S., but that certainly happens in Canada as well, in which LGBTQ plus educators are openly harassed and find themselves in a legal environment in which their protections are limited. You can actually decide for yourself whether or not you read the methodology pages. They run from pages 165 to 170. But from my perspective, they're actually kind of interesting, or quite interesting, as an example of how to work ethically with vulnerable populations to protect identities and that sort of thing. And you can look at the strategies that they use. You're free to skip that section if you want to, however, in order to make the length of the reading more reasonable. What follows in this interesting paper, after the methodology section, is a fascinating exploration of the substantial personal and professional challenges facing gay and lesbian educational leaders, and the ways in which they eventually not only meet those challenges, but gain strength from them, a theme that recurs in these papers. Last is a chapter in our book, Transforming Conversations by that is, the name of the book is Transforming Conversations, and the chapter was written by Tashika Pillay. Tashika is a graduate from the doctoral program in Ed Policy Studies, and I had the pleasure of teaching her in a course on feminism and leadership, as a matter of fact. And she challenged me throughout, and it was great having her in the class. She's the research coordinator at the Center for Global Citizenship in Education and Research in Ed Policy at the Faculty of Education. Tashika is a remarkable young woman who applies a critical lens to her everyday practices and experiences as an immigrant, a student, a teacher, and a feminist, and argues for the decolonizing of feminism and the knowledges that come from feminism that are privileged in schools. She uses her own experiences as a young immigrant child in a school in which her knowledges had no place, and then as a teacher in an Indigenous school in the North where she was both the other, that is, she was from outside the community and not Aboriginal, but she was teaching others like her who experienced discrimination at a deeply cultural and racial level, and in their case in ways that are embedded in the historical relations between Aboriginal peoples and the state in Canada. As the history of activism around gender in educational settings demonstrates, and we read a little bit about that in the chapter that you read in the first module, it has what Loretto calls a white default. That is, the results of that activism has mainly benefited white, middle-class, cisgender educators, and particularly women. For example, the historical record of activism that's questioned the labor arrangements around leadership in schools that were predominantly held by middle-class, cisgendered men was opposed by women's organizations that were primarily women, and the benefits that came out of that activism were enjoyed predominantly by white middle-class cisgender women. That is, white feminism was not as inclusive as it needed to be of the experiences, desires, and hopes of Black, Indigenous, lesbian, immigrant, and so on women. Minority women's voices were being ignored by majority women, just as majority women's voices have been ignored by men in educational institutions, and they were called on it, and rightly so. Intersectional feminists argued that it was essential for advocates to fight for the rights of all women in order to address the painful exclusions that were part of minority women's history. But we need to understand that even with all of that, the word intersectionality was not one that was in great use until Kimberly Crenshaw, who was a lawyer and advocate, came along and through an experience that I'll describe in a moment, came up with the term intersectionality. She did so in response to meeting a woman whose case, on the face of it, seemed winnable, but the court ruled against her. I'm going to read a short section from the book, Transforming Conversations, that explains the vexing legal issue that left racialized women with no redress in the courts. And it's just a short section. So the term intersectionality was coined by Kimberly Crenshaw, 1989, a Black feminist legal scholar, in her analysis of a case in which the federal courts dismissed the complaint of African American women who felt that they had been denied access to better jobs. The court ruled that the complaint fit neither race discrimination, because Black men were not barred from better jobs, nor sex discrimination, because white women were not barred from better jobs. This tortuous logic revealed the limits of so-called identity politics and the dominance of what Gordon says is a particular orientation that disaggregates or tears apart social problems into discrete challenges facing specific groups. And when they overlap, of course, the courts can't deal with them. Instead, intersectionality, Crenshaw argued, offers a way to consider oppression across categories in ways that revealed, rather than concealed, multiple layers of exclusion. You can actually go to the additional readings tab for a link to a TED Talk that Crenshaw did, in which she explains the legal issues involved that led her to consider this term intersectionality. And it's quite an interesting TED Talk. It turned out to be a powerful term that resonated with many who were trying to come to terms with the complexities of multiple layers of discriminatory behavior. And it was a word that was taken up in many social contexts, including education. So I'm now going to turn to a video that is less than 2 minutes long, in which Crenshaw talks about the meaning of intersectionality for educators.
Intersectionality is just a metaphor for understanding the ways that multiple forms of inequality or disadvantage sometimes compound themselves, and they create obstacles that often are not understood within conventional ways of thinking about anti-racism or feminism or whatever social justice advocacy structures we have. Intersectionality isn't so much a grand theory, it's a prism for understanding certain kinds of problems. African American girls are 6 times more likely to be suspended than white girls. That's probably a race and a gender problem. It's not just a race problem, it's not just a gender problem. So I encourage people to think about how the convergence of race stereotypes or gender stereotypes might actually play out in the classroom, between teachers and students, between students and other students, between students and administrators, and commit themselves to understanding that as a way of intervening and providing equal educational opportunity for all students, regardless of their identities. Identity isn't simply a self-contained unit. It is a relationship between people in history, people in communities, people in institutions. So schools do a good job when they understand that, and when they commit themselves to curricular development, opportunities in the school for all students to understand the histories that have brought us to this particular moment. You can't change outcomes without understanding how they've come about. So independent schools can take the lead on that, to be responsive to their student populations and to the communities out of which the students come.
The poem that Pillay begins her chapter with speaks so well to what Crenshaw describes when considering the experiences of students at the intersection of gender and other social identities that threaten to silence them, or students whose identities are not reflected in what they hear in their schools. And silencing is one of the themes that I'd like to pick up on. The poem reads, "I must speak bilingual." Of course, in Canada, that would be English or French. "I must speak bilingual. Neither one of them is mine. I must study centuries of history, none of it mine. I read 1,000 voices, none of them speak to me. Not one of them speak to me or speak of me. Am I entirely obscure? I see you talk and teach, but I can't hear a word you say." This poem reflects Crenshaw's remarks that raise some important issues for us as educators about what kinds of schools and educational institutions we wish to be part of. I suspect that if I asked you to write me something about this, that most of you would say we want our schools to be places in which students' learning prepares them for a successful future, however successful might be defined by them, and that they will be prepared to go on to contribute to making the world a better place. We want our classrooms to be caring and organized for excellent learning opportunities, and we want our pedagogy and curriculum to enable each student to achieve their full potential. So what potentially stands in the way of achieving those goals? There may be many challenges, but Crenshaw reminds us that schools can do a better job of achieving those goals when they understand the relationship between identity, that is, who I am, the way I think about myself, the way I am viewed by the world, and the characteristics that define me. All the parts of my identity and their relationship with history, community, and institutional structures. For me, that was an easy one because the school's activities, curriculum, both explicit and hidden, the language that was used, the social practices that were expected, reflected back to me my identity. However, what the articles we're reading for this unit suggests is that those who live at the intersections of gender and a minority status of race, gender and sexual identity, gender and citizenship, And we could add gender and disability, gender and class, and so on, often do not see themselves in the everyday practices, the curriculum, the pedagogy of their school. Further, they may experience racism, classism, homophobia, rejection, and a lack of inclusion. In effect, their history, culture, community affiliations, forms of knowledge, and so on are simply not a part of the school environment, and they are censured when they introduce other ways of knowing, being, and doing. We have seen this in Canadian schools with Aboriginal students, certainly, and many provinces are working hard at this point, finally recognizing that something needs to be done and imperfectly moving towards doing what needs to be done better. But we've seen the results of when what Crenshaw suggests is essential for schools to meet the needs of all students are not extended to First Nations, Métis, and Inuit students. Pellé's chapter makes clear how silencing of minority voices, history, knowledge, and identities had a profound effect on her as a young immigrant girl. It is this theme of silencing that I see in every one of these papers. It might be called, for example, in the paper on GLBTQ, or actually gay and lesbian principles, something else like being in the closet, but essentially we're talking about in silencing. It's arguably a profound silencing that shapes schooling for minority students, especially those at the intersection of gender and race, or minority sexual identities, or immigrant status, etc., and often in destructive ways. So we need to ask ourselves around silencing, whose voice is heard? When we think about silencing, whose history is available? When we think about silencing, whose knowledges are taught? And when we think about silencing, whose identity is honored? And these are the things we can think about when we think about practices in schools that we teach in and that we lead. Sadly, we may also see this kind of exclusion being played out with colleagues as well, who live at these same intersections that the students that we've just talked about live at. They live with the same absence that students do, and their valuable voices may be muted rather than included in the grand conversation of education. This theme of silencing of minority voices in schools can lead to the exclusion of the experience, knowledge base, and history that Black female leaders, Aboriginal women leaders, and gay and lesbian educators can offer and represent, and they do represent a loss to the school community when they're not. However, as all of the papers remind us, exclusion, silencing, and other tactics of discrimination that these educators that live at the intersections of all of these various forms of oppression may face also has the potential to cause an equal and opposite reaction, we might call it, that strengthens their determination to become a leader for social justice, contribute to a richer fabric of knowledge in the school through expressing their full identity, and provide a model and guide, not only to other minority students who benefit from seeing someone like themselves in their schools and classrooms, but also non-minority children and older students, in extending their awareness of the many ways of being in the world that contribute to everyone's knowledge and well-being. So I'm hoping that as you read your assigned paper, you'll identify both resistance to the experiences and voices of the research participants, as well as the benefits that those voices offer to their school and community. The reality is, if we want the kinds of schools and educational institutions and systems that Crenshaw talks about, that we talk about, ones in which each child and young person and adult learner is able to achieve their potential, then each paper in this module provides important clues about how that will be attained. So that means I'm really looking forward to learning from your input on each forum as we explore the meaning of intersectionality during this module, both its challenges and its possibilities, and the ways in which it links clearly and importantly to issues of gender. Okay.